That's right. That's the one. So, Sarah, I think you've been for us for many of these, but Elizabeth, I think you're fairly new to this. And what we've tried to do is a series of looking at the rabbis, capital R, meaning those who were foundational to Judaism as we know it, who lived between 200 BCE and 200 CE, and just try and get a sense of who they were as people. They're all really interesting, and they've got some bizarre and unusual stories to their lives. And many of them were very flawed people, but also people who contributed a lot to how we understand Judaism, arguably more than the Torah does and the characters therein. And what we've done is, we've started, I think, with Hillel and talked about rabbis like Akiva and Yochanan ben Zakkai, and last time Shimon bar Yochai. And tonight I want to talk about Rabbi Mé'ir, who is less well known, but is very influential in his own way, and is a really complicated character, as they all are, for a variety of reasons. So all of the sources, and I'm going to share my screen in a second, are just quotes from rabbinic sources, mostly the Talmud, and some places Midrashim that are around the same age as the Talmud. Most of these sources were written a couple hundred years after these people lived, but probably were retellings of oral stories about them, folk tales, combinations of different legends. Sometimes they're confused about who did what because it's been a while. And the stories about them are a big part of what makes up the rabbinic literature, not just the halakha, what do you do on Shabbat, but also what did Rabban Gamliel do this one time when this thing happened. The first page of the Talmud itself includes a long story about Rabban Gamliel and his debate about whether he should still do the Shema when he came back really late from a wedding party, so late that he was absolutely hammered, and the sun was about to come up, and he didn't know if he should still say the Shema even though the sun was about to come up. So it's very practical learning about their own lives, and that's the goal. So, like I said, I'm going to share my screen, and nobody wants to hear me talk the whole time, so hopefully you'll help me in reading, at least. And Rabbi Mé'ir is probably best known today for having a famous grave, which is just outside of Tiberias, Tiberia, if anyone's been there, and also for being the namesake of a very large charity in Israel called Rabbi Mé'ir Baal Hanes. In many kind of little shops in Israel, you'll find charity boxes at the checkout that have his name on it. And that's because there's a legend that he is somehow associated with doing miracles. And so there's lots of kind of supernatural stuff that's associated with him now. But the stories about him in the rabbinic literature itself are a little bit less fantastical, and much more you get a sense of an individual who was confused and a bit confusing. So I'll just read the first one here, which doesn't help us at all, but hopefully gives us a little bit of background into what we're dealing with. This is from the Talmud in Eruvin, and in discussing who Rabbi Mé'ir was, it says the following. His name was not actually Rabbi Mé'ir, but rather Rabbi Nehorai. Then why was he called Rabbi Mé'ir? Because he would enlighten the eyes of the sages with the law. Me'ir means enlightened, by the way, or shining. And similarly, Nehorai was not his name, but rather Rabbi Nehemiah. And others say Rabbi Elazar ben Arach was his name. Then why was he called Nehorai? Because he would enlighten the sages with the law. So we see that there's already a kind of a confusion about who Me'ir was. We don't know anything about his parents, unusual. We don't know anything about his early life. We don't know anything about any part of his life until he really becomes associated with the rabbinic movement and a student at the rabbinic academies. We know about his wife, who we'll talk about a little bit later, who's a character in her own right in these stories, but we don't know very much about his children, and we don't really get much sense of who he was as an individual. This quote from the Talmud, this first one, shows us that the Talmud itself is a bit confused about who he is. And some people claim that was actually a different name. Me'ir is just a nickname, and actually his name was Nehorai or Elazar or Nehemiah. And I think that goes to the root, actually, of how someone who is unclear in identity can have such a big influence. So we get a little bit more insight, perhaps, in how he has a relationship with his teachers. We talked 2 times ago about Rabbi Akiva, who was probably one of the most significant rabbis of this generation, had a huge role in the development of Judaism and in history and politics. And Me'ir seems to be Akiva's student. Even that is debated, though. Some say he was Ishmael's student. But usually he's told in stories to be Akiva's student. And there's a lot of stories that describe him and Akiva interacting. One of them is this story here, which is related by Rabban Gamliel, about thinking that each of them had died in a shipwreck. So one of you want to read this for us, if you feel up to it, if you can see the screen?
I don't mind.
Go for it.
Rabban Gamliel said, "Once I was traveling on a ship, and I saw another ship that had foundered and was sinking. I was pained by the thought of a Torah scholar who had been on that ship and was now surely lost. And who was that Torah scholar? It was Rabbi Akiva. But when I arrived on dry land, Rabbi Akiva himself came and sat and deliberated before me in a matter of law. I said to him, 'My son, who raised you up from out of the water?' He said to me, 'A board from the ship presented itself to me, and I took hold of it, and with every wave that came upon me, I bowed my head as it passed over me.' From here the sages said, 'If wicked people come upon a person, let him bow his head before them.' Rabbi Akiva said, 'Once I was traveling on a ship, and I saw another ship that was sinking in the sea. I was pained by the thought of a Torah scholar who had been on that ship and was now surely lost. And who was that Torah scholar? It was Rabbi Mé'ir. But when I landed in Cappadocia, Rabbi Mé'ir himself came and sat and deliberated before me in a matter of law. I said to him, 'My son, who raised you up out of the water?' He said to me, 'One wave swept me onto the next, and the next carried me onto the next, until the sea spat me out on dry land.'"
Okay. So immediately, right, we see that we have two repeated stories, right? The trope is the same, but they have different characters. So the first one is Rabban Gamliel, who's quite an elderly figure in this circle, right? This is the 130s, probably, we're thinking this takes place, about 135, somewhere around there. And he's telling a story about how once he was on a ship, he saw another ship sinking, and he knew that Rabbi Akiva had been on that ship, and he was really sad because Rabbi Akiva was such a great scholar. But then Rabbi Akiva showed up later that day on dry land, to everyone's surprise. And when he asked him, "How is it you survived?" he gives an explanation that a board from the ship kind of miraculously presented itself to him. He held on to it, and every wave that came over him, he just bowed his head down, and the wave just passed him over. So you have this image that he was saved through kind of submission to the waves, almost, and a sense of miraculous boards appearing. It's very kind of Titanic, right? He just happened to find that piece of wood to hang on to, and happened to be able to submit in a way that allowed him to survive. Akiva himself then is quoted as telling the same story, but not that he's the one who was on the shipwreck, but his student Rabbi Mé'ir. So either this is a joke or this is kind of a trope where they're telling the same story and they're changing the key part of it. And the second version, when Rabbi Akiva is saying about how he once was on a ship and saw a ship that sunk and knew Rabbi Mé'ir was on it, it was really sad because he thought Rabbi Mé'ir was a great Torah scholar, but then he showed up in Cappadocia, which is, by the way, now in Turkey. He deliberated and he said, "Who raised you out of the water?" And what is Rabbi Me'ir's answer? Is it different? How is it different, and why?
Well, he's much more passive, really, isn't he? It's just letting the waves are just pushing him to shore.
Yeah. Yeah, he seems kind of surprised almost, right? Well, one wave put me onto the next wave, and there it was. Then the sea even spits him out.
Yeah.
It's slightly different image from his teacher in that there's no miracle board that shows up. There's no ethical teaching, right? They use the Akiva example above to say, oh, this is why if someone is mean to you, you should bow your head before them. This kind of pacifistic attitude, which is surprising, by the way, for Akiva was a warlord. But the Me'ir version is very kind of weak. We don't really get much sense of who he was from this. You get a little bit of sense of who Akiva was. You get some character from it. But the Me'ir version is generic. He doesn't seem to be an actor at all. He's just floating along, being carried from one wave to the next and reacting. And actually, that's not a bad place to start, because a lot of the stories that we do see about him, he just seems to be a bit of a background character in his own life, which is a bit of a shame for anyone to be. So we've got a bunch of stories here that tell us a little bit about his personality, hopefully, and we try and get a picture of what he was like. Sarah, do you want to read? You up for it? Should we alternate, three of us?
Okay.
Rabbi Ali Abba Hamina said, "It is revealed and known before God, who spoke the world into being, that there was no one like Rabbi Mé'ir in his generation. Why did they not decide the halakha in accordance with his view? Because his colleagues could not fathom the depths of his reasoning. For he would assert that something impure was pure and make it seem plausible."
Okay. So what's the question they're asking? This is Rabbi Acha Bar Chanina. He's much later. He's asking a question kind of out of curiosity.
He's saying, why wasn't he elevated by taking note of his halakha?
Yeah.
That he would write the halakha.
Yeah, everyone says he's so great, but actually, whenever there's a debate, no one ever decides in favor of Me'ir, right? The halakha never follows Me'ir. There's certain people where, when there's a debate, the halakha tends to follow them. They tend to have the balance of vindication on their side. Hillel and Shammai disagreed about almost everything, and in our tradition, about 80% of the time we follow Hillel. A few times we follow Shammai. Me'ir is the Shammai of that situation. He almost never follow what Me'ir says. Whenever he's quoted, they just disregard him. And yet, he's seen as such a great figure. So this rabbi later is asking, how could he be so great and yet never actually have his view heard and decided in favor of? And what's the answer that he gets?
Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said, Rabbi Me'ir once went to Asia to sorry, I can't read.
No, it's a weird word, intercalate, which is to calculate the calendar.
Yeah, the script is a bit funny.
Oh, is it not showing up clearly?
Well, it's quite small. Intercalate the year, and he could not find a scroll of Esther written in Hebrew, so he wrote one from memory and then went back and read from it.
Okay. Quite an impressive feat, right? I mean, it's not every day you can, oh, I forgot my book at home. No worries. I'll just write it down and then I'll have it to read. So we have.
He obviously thought very highly of his intellect.
Yes.
Say more.
Well, until this paragraph, where presumably Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar would have known the scroll of Esther and the writing, and would have vouched that it was accurate. Before that, it was as though they couldn't understand what he was saying, so it could almost be that they assumed
Yes.
he was very bright, and maybe he was just pulling a fast one.
Yeah, I love that. No, you definitely get this sense that, like, they're all kind of like, well, he seems really clever.
Yeah.
And he does all this stuff, but we don't really get it. Like, nobody seems to get him. They all have a lot of respect for him, but nobody really seems to get what he's doing. He never seems to have the same view as everyone else. He's a bit of an outlier, yet he's universally respected, which is strange.
Presumably he did know the writings of the scroll of Esther.
I mean, I hope so. It's a pretty serious thing to read from a non-kosher scroll of Esther on Purim. So, you have to be really confident. It's not like he could look it up on Google and check that he got it all, right? You have to be really confident that you had every letter there. As a scribe, especially, which he was, as we'll see, he worked as a scribe as his day job. You really know the rules. The rules are pretty high stakes. If you mess up one letter, you can't read it. It's not kosher. So it's a pretty big deal to do it from memory. It's not something you hear about often.
But perhaps because he was a scribe, it was maybe easier to
Yeah.
remember.
It does explain a little bit, because the thing that the scribes, most scribes who write, they only write 1 or 2 Torah scrolls in their lifetime, maybe, but they write a lot of Megillat Esther, because every synagogue uses it, and a lot of people have one at home, and it's not that expensive, and it's not that long. So I guess it's not unusual that, that if you wrote it once a year, or twice or 3 or 4 times a year, every year for a while, you'd probably have it memorized eventually. But it definitely is a testament to his skill.
He made a photographic memory.
Yes. Yeah, what we would now call a photographic memory may also be at play, which is very useful for a scribe, obviously. You definitely get the sense he's kind of a bit of an eccentric, I suppose. And the other rabbis are commenting on him, being like, "Yeah, we don't really know what he was doing, but he was great. He was, there was no one like him in his generation." We assume that's a very positive thing, but it may be a bit more mixed. Elizabeth, do you want to read this third one on the page?
Okay. And I hated all the labor with which I labored under the sun. Rabbi Mé'ir was a skillful scribe and used to earn 3 seller coins each week. He spent 1 seller on food and drink, another on clothing, and the third on supporting rabbinical scholars. His disciples asked him, "What are you doing to provide for your children?" He answered, "If they are righteous, then it will be as David said, for I have not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his descendants begging for bread. If they are not righteous, why would I leave my possessions to the enemies of the Omnipresent?" Therefore Solomon said, "And who knows whether he will be wise or foolish?"
So what are the elements here, and why is this yet another surprising behavioral move? First of all, 3 Salaim is a lot, by the way.
Okay.
Just for context, it's like, it's a lot of money that's being described here. He evidently was a very skillful scribe and was paid a lot to do it. 3 selah a week is a high income in this society. And he's spending a third of his income on food and drink, a third on clothing, and a third on charity, on supporting rabbinical scholars, which is great, right? Nothing to fault there. But his students are a little bit concerned that he doesn't seem to be doing anything to provide for his family.
Except that if is the food and drink just for him?
Well,
Or-
presumably he's feeding his family. I hope. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
But he's not saving anything. He's not
No.
leaving anything behind. He's
No.
not putting anything in a Rabbi Mé'ir trust for his children to inherit later. Nor is he apparently kind of investing it, or he's living very much in the moment, we might say today. And his students are somewhat surprised about this because they feel like he's neglecting an obligation, right? What are you doing to provide for your children is rather a loaded question, because the answer is nothing.
It's because he thinks that they'll take care of themselves if they're righteous.
Yeah.
Then they'll be provided for anyway.
What if they're not righteous?
Well, bad luck. They're doomed.
Yeah. What a bizarre attitude to hear, right? If they're not righteous, then why would I ever give my possessions to the enemies of God, right? Suddenly, there's very dramatic language about his children. If they're righteous, they'll be fine. If they're not righteous, then, well, screw them.
I hope he was rounding up when, and it's sort of rough when he says they spent a third on clothing. Presumably, it's not just clothing; it'll be clothing the household.
Yes. Yeah, maybe we can be generous and say it's kind of bills.
And clothing his children.
Yeah. I mean, there is a halachic obligation to provide on the part of a man to his wife food and clothing. So we can assume that he was fulfilling that. There's no real obligation, though, to leave an inheritance for your children. It's it's common wisdom. It's something that people do. And here is another example of somewhere we see Me'ir doing something different than what people do. He does what is required of him, it seems.
Yeah.
And if they could make a halachic argument, if they could say, well, Me'ir, it says here that you should leave money for your children, then maybe he would be convinced. But he's not going to be kowtowed by conventional wisdom of the day. He has his own view on these questions, and they're very different than other people's.
And maybe he's kind of what he is leaving his children or providing is an example to follow.
Yeah.
A righteous example to follow.
I hope so. Yeah. Otherwise, pretty high stakes, I suppose. Right? If you have this approach to people that either they're righteous and they're okay, or they're not righteous and no one should care about them anyway, it's pretty dramatically black and white view of the world. But it could be very inspiring as well, I imagine.
Yeah.
Could go either way. Okay. I'll read this next one here, which is again about how Rabbi Mé'ir does things differently than everyone else. So Rabbi Mé'ir, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yosei were traveling on the road. Rabbi Mé'ir would examine the name of the owner of the lodgings where they intended to stay. But Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosei would not. When they came to a certain place, they asked for lodging and were given it. They asked the owner, "What is your name?" He said to them, "Kidor." Rabbi Mé'ir said only to himself, "Infer from this that he is a wicked man, as it is written, for they are a generation, Kidor, of treachery, children in whom I have no trust." Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi entrusted their money purses to him. Rabbi Mé'ir did not. The next day, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi said to the host, "Give us back our purses." He said to them, "You never gave me your purses." Rabbi Mé'ir said to them, "Why did you not examine his name?" They said to him, "Why did you not tell us?" He said to them, "When I said that one should be particular about names, I meant only that suspicion was warranted, not that he was definitely wicked." So what image are we getting from these little, really anecdotes about Me'ir here?
He sounds very arrogant.
Okay.
He sounds like he just expects people to, I don't know. I mean, he's going to do what he thinks is right. And if other people, don't, they can do what they think. And
yeah. And that's on them, right? The same attitude that you saw with his kids of, well, if they're not righteous, what, I'm going to give my money to the enemies of God. So, here he has his own procedure to weed out people who thinks are bad, which is to analyze their names. And if when they tell him their name, he thinks of a biblical verse that has some sign of being a bad omen, then he behaves differently. He decided not to give this guy his money because his name was Kidor, and it sounds kind of like this verse in Deuteronomy where it talks about people being treacherous. So he's not going to give them his money. Now, probably his friends here thought he was being bonkers, right? You can imagine them kind of making fun of him, like, that doesn't make any sense, right?
Yeah.
That's just superstition. And lo and behold, in this case, he was right. The guy turned out to be a bit of a schmuck, and they took the money of his friends and didn't take Meir's money. And his interaction is really, really interesting, right? They say to him, Rabbi Mé'ir starts by saying, "Why don't you do what I do?" Right? It's this very clueless kind of lack of social skills response where as they're lamenting the fact that all their money's been stolen, he goes, "Well, why don't you just do what I do?" So it can be very arrogant. It can also be a bit kind of just, head in the clouds, bit clueless, doesn't really understand what the right thing to say is. And they angrily say, "Why don't you tell us? If you knew he was bad, why don't you tell us?" And his response is, "Well, it was only a guess, right? Yeah, it meant that you should be suspicious, but I didn't know he was for sure wicked, so I couldn't say this guy is wicked." It's a strange interaction in many ways, and their anger at him seems to be something that has been practiced. Right? You get the sense that it's not the first time that Me'ir has done something weird, and they don't quite understand, and they're irritated by his behavior, and he doesn't seem to understand why they're irritated. Okay.
He did sort of tell them. It's just, I mean, they thought he, like you say, they thought he was just being daft.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
I really don't think you should trust this man because of his name. They'd have,
Yeah, they wouldn't have listened probably anyway, right? They would have just ignored him.
yeah.
Only after the fact did they go, why didn't you tell us?
Mm.
So it's not really, it's interesting, a story, because it's clearly, it's not someone who's right and someone who's wrong. Other than the innkeeper is clearly in the wrong, stealing his guests' money. That's a different problem. But, you get the sense it's a common problem in that day and age. But
Yeah.
Me'ir isn't necessarily right or wrong, neither are his friends. It's just that he clearly is different from them, right? You get the sense even the language emphasizes it. This language in Hebrew is not usual, where it says this Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi entrusted their money purse to him. Rabbi Me'ir did not. Right? The really emphasizing that he did not do what they did, right? He examined names, they do not. So
he shared his money out with them afterwards.
well, we do know he gave a third of his income to rabbinical scholars, so I hope that he helped these guys get their money back. We know he was generous, and yet we also know he's a bit kind of either arrogant or just aloof in some way. It's an interesting combination, right? We know him to be someone who's both very generous and also someone who doesn't really understand the people around him or why they're upset.
And he's entitled to be like that if that's the way his makeup is.
Yeah, I suppose, right? He's also very skilled, right? He's an artist and an artisan. He's very skilled as a scribe. Those are the things we know about him so far. And he didn't particularly try very hard to rescue himself when he drowned or nearly drowned. He just kind of floated around back, which is rather an irritating thing to read, right? If you meet someone who nearly drowned and you want to say, how did you get out of the water? And they'd say, I don't know, just floated. It's like, hey, come on, there's got to be more of a story. Akiva played into the drama. Oh, there was a piece of wood and I held on to it and I put my head down under the waves. Me'ir is just kind of, doesn't care for the story. He's not interested in what other people want to hear.
It seems to me that today we'd probably say he was autistic. I mean, he's got that sort of sense of, it's kind of, to him, it's very direct, it's very obvious.
Yes.
He doesn't understand nuance.
Yes. I mean, I think there's definitely a way in which these stories together make a picture of someone who's kind of neurodivergent in some way, who just thinks differently and honestly doesn't often understand why other people don't think the way he does. It's not that he's being cruel, it's that he just doesn't get it, right? His brain works differently. I don't want to read too much into it, but no, I agree. It's hard not to see that in some way when you get this, particularly this story of him just being like, I don't know, what did you want me to do? It's so obvious what anyone else would do, and he does something different.
Yeah.
It's rare that we have any direct quotes from him, but there is this one piece in Barachot, which is all about blessings and prayers, in which they often actually have a prayer that he would say. So they quote Me'ir directly with a prayer that he would often say. Sarah, do you want to read this for us, if you can?
Rabbi Mé'ir would often say, learn with all your heart and all of your soul to know my ways and to be industrious by the doors of my Torah. Guard my Torah in your heart and let the awe of me be seen by you, and guard your mouth from any mistakes. Purify and separate yourself from all trespass and iniquity, and I will be with you everywhere.
Okay. Lovely little prayer. What does it tell us about his idea of God?
It's quite demanding.
It's
a lot of you.
Different things than we've seen elsewhere. If you think about kind of other prayers, other language.
God will be with you if you follow my laws.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's very personal, those laws, right? It's about kind of your personal behavior, very much about learning with all your heart, being industrious, guarding the Torah in your heart, being in awe, guarding your mouth from any mistakes. It's interesting prayer. I mean, it's not unusual language at all, but combined together, it's rather specific to this kind of vision of a very personal, disciplined approach to life, which is rewarded with closeness and intimacy with God.
Mm.
It's not about, God isn't promising reward or riches or fertility, which is usually the kind of things that God's promising. God's just promising, I'll be there and I'll be with you. That's the exchange, which is really quite different and very subtle compared to a lot of the prayers of the time. Okay, fabulous story here about Rabbi Mé'ir as a pastoral presence. Elizabeth, do you want to read this one for us? It goes over the next page.
Okay. Rabbi Mé'ir used to deliver discourses on Shabbat evenings. There was a woman who was in the habit of coming to listen to him. Once the discourse lasted a long time, and she waited until it was concluded. She went home and found that the candle had gone out. Her husband asked her, "Where have you been?" She said, "I was sitting and listening to the voice of the preacher." He said to her, "I swear that I will not let you enter here again until you go and spit in the preacher's face." She stayed away 1 week, a second, a third. Her neighbors said to her, "Are you still angry with one another? Let us come with you to the discourse." As soon as Rabbi Mé'ir saw them, he saw by means of the Holy Spirit all that had transpired, and he said, "Is there a wise woman among you who is expert at whispering a charm over an eye?" The woman's neighbors said to her, "If you go and spit in his eye, you will release your husband from his vow." When she sat down before him, she became afraid and said to him, "Rabbi, I am not an expert at whispering an invocation over an eye." He said to her, "Even so, spit in my face 7 times, and I will be cured." She did so, and he said to her, "Go tell your husband, you told me to do it once, but I spat 7 times." His disciples said to him, "Should people thus abuse the Torah? Could you not have told one of us to whisper an invocation for you?" He said to them, "Is it not good enough for Rabbi Mé'ir to be like his creator? For Rabbi Yishmael has taught, 'Great is peace for the Holy One, blessed be God,' said that even God's great name, written in sanctity, may be blotted out in water for the purpose of making peace between a husband and a wife."
Okay. The story is actually a bit more complex than it seems at first pass. It took me a little bit to see it myself. So let's just kind of go back through it. Thank you for reading.
Okay.
So every Friday night, Rabbi Mé'ir would give the drasha at the synagogue. Right? That was his thing. He had that role. And there was a woman who would come every week to listen to him. One time, it lasted such a long time that by the time she got home, the candles that she had lit earlier in the evening had gone out. Right? Meaning, of course, pre-electric society. Too late for dinner, there's no food, there's no, you would have to go to bed. Her husband is furious and says, "Where have you been?" She says, "Oh, I was at synagogue listening to this rabbi." And he makes a vow. Now, a vow is a very serious thing in this society. He makes a vow, an oath, and says, "I will not let you enter here again until you go and spit in his face." Kind of a weird oath. Right, I think we can all acknowledge that's kind of a weird oath. Also a bit dramatic. The husband is really the most childish character in the story for sure. Nonetheless, it's an oath, and so she goes and lives somewhere else. We don't know where. Stays away 1 week, and then a second week, and the third week. Her neighbors are getting really worried, and they say, "Listen, are you still angry? Why don't we all go see that rabbi, and we'll figure out a way to solve this problem?" So they go on Friday evening to Rabbi Mé'ir's synagogue in order to hear him speak. And at that moment that they come in, he has a magical understanding. It just pops into his brain, the entire story of what happened. The woman, her husband, the spitting, the vow, her friends, that she's been away 3 weeks. He knows immediately what the story is with her without ever having met her before. Okay? And he comes up with in his head going, how can I get this woman how can I make her life easier? How can I help her get back home to her husband? I know what I'll do. I'll ask this group of ladies that just came in, if anyone, I'll say my eye is hurting. and asked them if anyone has a particular ability to say a blessing, to whisper an invocation, right? To say a magic spell about my eye. Say I need help, and asked if any of them are good at doing this sort of thing, which is what he does. He goes up. He says, are any of you ladies good at saying magical spells over eyes? And of course, the neighbors, the woman's friends, see this as a great opportunity, as he knew they would. And they start elbowing the woman and going, hey, look, you can say that you know a magical spell, and then when you get close to him, just spit in his eye and run away. And that way you'll finish the oath. So that's what she plans to do, right? She presumably tells him, oh, I know. She goes to sit down in order to say her magic invocation, and then finally has to admit, I actually don't know how to do this. And he goes, without missing a beat, right, because he set the whole thing up, he goes, that's fine. I don't care. Just spit in my face 7 times instead. That'll cure my eye, which doesn't make any sense. But she does it. And he says, again, how would he ever possibly know? She must have been quite surprised. Go tell your husband you told me to do it once, but I did it 7 times. He gets over enthusiastic about helping her fulfill this vow. And he makes her spit in his face 7 times. And his students, as usual, are shocked by his behavior, right? Remember the first thing we read about no one really understood. They all knew he was brilliant, but they didn't really understand how. And his students go, well, you couldn't have just asked one of us to do this for you. If your eye was hurting, we would have gotten you some medicine. And he says, don't judge me. I'm doing holy work here. Is it not good enough for me to be like God, right? God who thinks that making peace between husband and wife is a good thing. That's all I'm trying to do. You have this real sense of him just completely wholeheartedly and with no concern for the fact this is utterly humiliating for himself, try and help this stranger who walked into a synagogue, who he magically understood her situation, by creating a situation where she wouldn't have to ask to spit in his face. Right? So, crazy story. What does that tell us about him?
Well, it's very insightful. Possibly.
Yeah. Enthusiastic, right? Once he decides this crazy plan, he goes all the way in.
Yeah.
He knows his Torah, and he wants to do right.
Yeah. He's clearly not bothered that his students think he's crazy, right? Like he doesn't care at all. And he doesn't really care about the fact that this woman is coming to his synagogue and to everyone else who's watching, spitting in his face 7 times. He has no problem being humiliated, it seems, as long as he's doing the right thing. Right. And to go back to your point, Elizabeth, about kind of there being a slightly autistic temperament to many of this, he has a sense of what is the right thing, and he's going to do anything to achieve that. And he's not too bothered about what other people think or whether or not other people judge him for it or how it looks or how people feel about it. What he thinks is the right thing is what he's going to do.
Which is laudable.
Yeah, it is. In this case, he does something overly generous and compassionate in a way that most people would have not been able to pull off, because they couldn't have been as forthright and as they couldn't have set up the situation. They would have been embarrassed for themselves. He's not embarrassed. He doesn't care. He's not fussed about the fact that he's getting himself spat at. It is very unusual, and it tells you a lot, actually, about his character in some way. But there's a flip side to the kind of rigid righteousness that comes with that, of always being right, which is that sometimes you get too obsessed with being right, and you start to forget the fact that other people are involved in it. We're going to see the worst outcome of this in a moment. Because a lot of the stories about Rabbi Mé'ir are actually not about him, but about his wife, Bruria.
Mm.
She's the only woman who is quoted among the rabbis and is cited in the Talmud. She's cited, I think, over 100 times as having an opinion on different arguments. And often the halakha follows her opinion. So she clearly was very knowledgeable and very well respected. And she also meets an untimely end, as we'll see shortly. But first, we have a lovely story about Rabbi Mé'ir and Satan getting into a tangle, stroke, a kind of weird sexual sting. I think it's my turn. Rabbi Mé'ir used to scoff at sinners. One day, Satan appeared to Rabbi Mé'ir disguised as a woman on the far side of the river. There was no ferry boat, so he grasped onto a rope and proceeded to cross. When he reached the middle of the rope, Satan released him from his grip. Satan said to Rabbi Mé'ir, had they not proclaimed in heaven, be cautious of Rabbi Mé'ir and his Torah learning, I would have made your life worth just 2 mea coins. What's happening here? What's he trying to do, and why does it start by telling us he used to scoff at sinners?
It's what he wanted, isn't it? That was Satan's job to well, not treat people well.
What is Satan's job, right? Satan is not the devil of the Christian imagination. Satan is a prosecutor, right? So what's Satan's job is to catch people out, being hypocrites mostly.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is a hard one, but I think the implication is that Rabbi Mé'ir could be very judgmental, scoffing at sinners. And actually, this one time Satan tricked him into, pretending to be a beautiful woman, and there wasn't even a boat, so he started climbing across a rope to try and get to this woman. By the time he got halfway, Satan dropped him in the river, but made his point, which is, you can't be so judgmental of other people when you're rushing to go sin yourself. It's a strange one, but it's somewhat important to frame the question of what happens to Bruria, because her role in his life is often to try and make him less extreme. So there's a famous story. I'm going to jump down first. Actually, we're going to read the last story and then work our way back up. So there's this famous story here, the last one, about a heretic and what Bruria says to him. Either of you feel up to reading this one?
Okay. A heretic in Rabbi Me'ir's neighborhood used to distress him using biblical verses. Rabbi Me'ir prayed to God that the heretic should die. But Bruria said to him, how can you wish that he should die? Is it because it is written, let sins desist from the earth? Does it say sinners? It says sins. Furthermore, look at the end of the verse, and let evildoers be no more. Since sin will desist, evildoers will be no more. You should pray for them to repent. Rabbi Me'ir prayed for him, and he repented.
Okay. So really interesting setup, right? That there's someone in Rabbi Me'ir's neighborhood, a heretic. This means a Christian in this time period, right? One of the early Christians who he's distressing him with biblical verses, right? He used to come by and say, oh, well, this verse in Isaiah, that's talking about Jesus, and this verse here and this verse there. And it really bothered him, right? He was really irritated by this. So he prayed that this guy should die.
She's really a bit over the top.
It is, right? Again, it is very consistent, though, with what we've seen from Rabbi Mé'ir, is like, he goes all in. So this guy gets on his nerves. He goes, I wish this guy would die. His wife, Bruria, who's considerably more sensible, says, how can you wish they should die? Look, and here she proves from the verse in Psalm 104. It doesn't say let sinners die. It says let sins die. So it's the things that people do that are a problem, not the people. Once people stop doing bad stuff, then they can become good people. People aren't bad, right? They do bad things, is Bruria's message, which is true. And she convinces him you should pray for him to repent instead. He does, and it works, right? So you see the power that he has, and also the fact that he kind of uses it very uncautiously.
Yeah.
And this position that Bruria played in trying to moderate his extreme, one-sided, sometimes unthinking allegiance to what is right at all costs. So there's a looming question in the Torah, which is what happened in the Torah, in the Talmud, and elsewhere. What happened to Bruria? It's never really explained directly, but there's multiple references. And Rashi, commenting on one of these stories, explained this top story here about the Bruria incident. Sarah, if you can read that.
The Aurora incident.
That should be once, sorry.
She once disparaged the sage's dictum that the minds of women are easily swayed. Rabbi Mé'ir warned her, by your life, ultimately, you will acknowledge the truth of their words. He ordered one of his disciples to test her fidelity, and after many days of resisting his overtures, she finally consented. When the matter became known to her, she hanged herself, and Rabbi Mé'ir fled to the land of Israel out of shame.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, very bleak, right? This explanation from Rashi, which is much later, is filling in the gaps that aren't really explained in the story of Rabbi Mé'ir, but it explains partially, you know, why there's so much uncertainty about his character. And it also, this is the unfortunate flip side of the story we saw with the woman spitting in the face, right? So there's a statement in the Talmud at one point that women's minds are easily swayed. Women have light minds, which obviously is both misogynistic and untrue. And Bruria, being a well-educated woman who was respected among the rabbis, evidently took umbrage with this, rightly so. Rabbi Mé'ir, for whatever reason, disagreed with her and says, nope, eventually you're going to see the truth of their words about how women are easily swayed. And to prove his point, right, it's this guy who goes so far to prove his point, he doesn't realize what he's doing. He hires one of his students to seduce his wife, and eventually the student succeeds, and she's so ashamed that she dies by suicide, and he has to then leave for the land of Israel out of shame. We don't know where he lived before with Bruria. So it's like, you know, a real object lesson in how to take things too far. He so wanted to be right that he actually cost his wife her life.
But he said that husband and wife should get on at all costs.
Exactly. Right. He did that whole crazy thing to help this husband and wife. And yet in this case, he doesn't see it as a conflict between husband and wife that should be made peaceful. He sees it as righteous and unrighteous, that she is being unrighteous by criticizing the words of the sages. He can't see both sides of that. He only sees it from his very limited point of view, it seems. It's dramatic and kind of soap opera worthy, this whole thing. And you know, it obviously is part of the tragedy that lingers behind Rabbi Mé'ir, that he's so brilliant, but no one really understands what's going on, right? He's so compassionate, and yet he doesn't understand. He was so unhuman in some way in this conflict with his wife, right? It's how can it be both at the same time? He doesn't make sense to people.
No.
I don't understand the bigger picture.
Yeah. There's two interesting follow-ups from this, which are the last ones I've included here. The first is a rather strange statement. This is actually from much later. This is from a rabbi writing in the 16th century, but writing what he thinks is the backstory. He says, in the beginning, they reasoned that the halacha does not follow Rabbi Eliezer, and they would teach the oral Torah to girls, right? So that means the Talmud. So evidently Rabbi Eliezer thought that girls should not learn the Talmud. But a consequence of not listening to Rabbi Eliezer was Bruria, who was a well-educated woman who knew the Talmud. But after what happened to Bruria, the sages agreed in the first chapter of Avodah Zarah, the halacha should follow Rabbi Eliezer. So it's kind of a double defeat for any sense of egalitarianism here, in that not only is Bruria set up to fail and in a very tragic way dies, but then the fact that she died and the fact that this whole thing enveloped where they had a conflict over the halacha, and as a result, this whole thing fell out, which was entirely Me'ir's fault, is blamed on her. And as a result, women are prohibited from learning Talmud, which is pretty upsetting. And extremely unfair. And you know, no one is saying, and by the way, Me'ir was ridiculous, right? It's absolutely unfair, it seems. But it's not all roses for Me'ir. Not everyone has praise for him. Not everyone is unequivocally positive about his behavior. We do see, and this is the last bit here from elsewhere in the Jerusalem Talmud, that they actually tried to excommunicate Rabbi Mé'ir. We don't know if they succeeded. they tried to excommunicate him, that is to put him in cherem, to kick him out of the rabbinic community. And he said to them, I will not listen to you until you tell me who gets excommunicated, for what reasons, and for how many offenses. Which I just think is such a nice note to end on, because it is completely consistent with the character we've seen, right? If someone tells you in an esteemed group of peers, we think we're going to kick you out, your first reaction hopefully would be, oh, I'm so sorry if I did anything wrong. Try and make apologies, try and maybe make things right, try and save face, something. Not Rabbi Mé'ir. Rabbi Mé'ir responds and says, I want to see the policy. Who do you excommunicate? Why? What are the reasons? How many offenses do they do? Is kind of completely unlikable, right? In that sense, it's very hard to see him as someone who could be liked by his peers, even if he is deeply respected by them. And, it's interesting, as you said, Elizabeth, to think about Mé'ir as an example of someone who might be neurodivergent, because obviously they have no language for that. And they have no idea of what we would now call and label as being a spectrum of neurodivergence. But the impact on Me'ir's life from not being understood by his friends, from not having the support to understand himself and communicate better, is definitely familiar, I think, to many people today, and in quite a sad way. But it's ultimately a bit of a tragedy. His wife, who presumably he values a lot the role of marriage, as we saw his role in patching up a marriage, she dies. It's his fault. He's excommunicated. His friends respect him, but they don't want anything to do with him. And ultimately, he's kind of held up as part of the tradition, but he's never really cited. He's never really listened to. He's just there in the background, someone who's respected but not actually appreciated. And it's a different picture than the other rabbis we've seen, right? And that's part of the reason I wanted to bring this one tonight, because the other rabbis we've seen, Akiva, Shimon Bar Yochai, a lot of them were inflexible. A lot of them had political agendas, but all of them were pretty good at social skills and interacting with people and figuring out the right way to control people and say what they wanted to say. And as a result, a lot of them were morally quite compromised, right? We saw stories where the rabbis did things that we wouldn't agree with, and ultimately were difficult to see. They're more complicated, real people. Mé'ir is not very complicated, and he's not morally compromised. He's consistent in his morality. He's completely consistent, but the consistency has some knock-on effects which are really detrimental. And it's kind of the other side. If we think back to his prayer that we quote him as saying about, if only you can keep your mouth from saying the wrong thing and keep your heart with Torah, and then God will be with you. You can kind of imagine perhaps why those were the words he said. And perhaps is very relatable for many people today, as someone who is right and righteous, but who as a result isn't always free from being in the wrong in other people's eyes. So a really interesting character. There's many more stories than we could include here. I encourage you to read a bit more about them. And if you ever get into Tiberias, you can visit his grave, which ironically many people go at to pray for all sorts of very supernatural things, like finding a good partner, and income, and that they should leave a good inheritance for their children. I don't think he would appreciate all of that himself based on what we see him here. But nonetheless, he's remained in the popular consciousness in people's minds today, and is on many Israelis, someone who is a household name, but not necessarily for these stories, and more for the legend that grew up around him. So thank you for joining me, and hopefully, we can learn the right things from Mé'ir and not the wrong things.